Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 3 Biopsychology and the Foundations of Neuroscience. And we're going to take a look at Part 1. So, the question is, what is bioscience? And bioscience is the specialty in psychology that studies the interaction of biology, behavior, and mental processes. And along that lines, you got to talk about neuroscience, which is a relatively new disciplinary field that focuses on the brain and its role in the psychological process. How are genes and behavior linked? Well, we're going to take a look at evolution. This is the gradual process of biological change that occurs in a species as it adapts to its environment. And probably one of the best known people when it comes to this subject was a man named Charles Darwin. And he wrote in 1859, The Origin of Species. And that book, for the most part, made a case for evolution of life. From his observations on how organisms adapted to their environment, the variations that allowed species to succeed. And hence we get the concept of natural selection. And natural selection is basically evolution. The environment selects the fittest organisms. And if we break this down, we can talk a little bit about something called nature and nurture. Okay, and when we talk about these items here, nature for the most part is the biological basis, and nurture for the most part is the role of learning or environment. And from there, we can talk about genetics and inheritance. I think in your biology classes or anatomy and physiology, you might have heard a little bit about genotypes, which is an organism's genetic makeup, and also the phenotypes, which is the organism's observable physical characteristics. And both of these come into play when we talk about how behavior is impacted by our gene pool or our environment. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about DNA, also known as the oxoribonucleic acid. And for the most part, this is a long, complex molecule that encodes genetic characteristics. When we talk about genes, we have over 30,000 genes, and these are segments of chromosomes that encode the directions for inherited physical or mental characteristics. Nucleotides. This is a smaller molecular unit of a gene, and the genetic code uses 4 nucleotides that fit together in pairs, kind of like zipper tubes. And chromosomes, there are 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. Half come from your mother, half come from your father. There are tightly coiled thread-like structures along the genes where they are organized like beads on a necklace. And when we talk about sex chromosomes, that's either the X or Y chromosome that determines our physical sex. We inherit one from each of our parents, randomly selected. So double X equals female, XY equals male, Y only from the father. Psychology and your environment, choosing your children's genes, which is incredibly controversial. As a matter of fact, as of recent times, there has been a doctor in China who has kind of come under a lot of scrutiny for basically making a designer child by messing with the genes here. So let's talk a little bit about Dolly the sheep. She's kind of the one who kind of gets this all started, kind of going back a couple decades, but she was a sheep whose DNA was replicated to make an identical copy of itself. And the first time that we were actually able to map out the human genetic code was the Human Genome Project. Also started a couple decades ago and kind of wrapped up in recent days. But it was a project that completed the first draft of the human genetic code and has been used in research of many diseases and disorders. And really, the impact of this research probably has yet to be fully determined because we're learning so much just by this initial mapping. Along with that, stem cells. For the most part, this is a generic cell that has not fully committed itself to becoming a particular type of tissue, and hence it could be used in situations where we have individuals who might have problems with cancer, and you could replace cells, perhaps maybe grow new cells where it might be needed. Again, the full impact of that has not really been determined, but we do know that there has been controversies about how stem cells have been harvested. If they've been harvested from human aborted tissues, that can be a very moral issue that might impact the nature of research. And then finally, the issue with cloning. This is the replication of a segment of DNA, in other words, an identical copy. This kind of goes back to Dolly, as we mentioned before, but there's some questions about how this might be used. And in the case of, as I mentioned before, the doctor from China, this could be a real complex moral issue as we go forward. Thank you very much.